labor building at Chechnik, where a few minutes before, a blast had partially wrecked the edifice. 3 policemen were blown to bits when they tried to remove an explosive-laden truck. Shaky walls are torn down. After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut.
88 innocent people died, and a good deal of the British High Command was wiped out. Their goal was to drive the British out of Palestine. The mastermind of the King David bombing was Menachem Begin. He would become Israel's Prime Minister. His accomplice, Yitzhak Shamir, would also later become Prime Minister. The pattern of terrorists, or, in other words, brutal military leaders transforming into top politicians, is very common in Israeli politics.
וכך אמר חיים הזז, מהוגי הדעות של ההנהגה הציונית, במוסף הארץ, אלול תש"ג 1943. אין הציונות והיהדות דבר אחד, אלא 2 דברים השונים זה מזה. בוודאי 2 דברים הסותרים זה את זה.
הציונות נובעת מתוך התנועה הלאומית באירופה, ואין לה בעצם מקום לחרדים בתוכה.
הציונות מתחילה ממקום הריסת היהדות, ממקום שתש כוחו של העם. דבר אחד ברור, הציונות לא המשך, לא רפואה למכה, היא עקירה והריסה. אדרבה, היא מסיחה את דעתה מן העם, מתנגדת לו, הולכת נגד רצונו ורוחו, חותרת תחתיו ועוקרת אותו ופורשת ממנו לדרך אחרת, למטרה רחוקה ומסוימת. היא וקומץ אנשים בראשה גרעין של עם אחר. בבקשה לשים לב, לא חדש, לא מחודש, אלא אחר. מי שאינו סבור כך, או שטועה, או שהוא מרמה את עצמו.
En 1946, le nationalisme juif n'est plus une utopie. Il y a 500 000 juifs en Palestine. Ils exigent des visas pour 100 000 rescapés du génocide. Ils ne parlent plus de foyer national, mais d'indépendance. Depuis 1942, Ben Gourion a fait prendre un tournant au mouvement sioniste. L'alliance avec les Britanniques est terminée. C'est à présent vers les États-Unis, les grands vainqueurs de la guerre, que son regard se porte. Tous les ans, les Juifs américains offrent 50 millions de dollars au sionisme.
The late President of the United States, and only recently the joint resolution of the United States Congress asking for freedom of Jewish immigration, which will result in a free and democratic Jewish Commonwealth.
At this point, the British have had enough, and they transferred the matter of Palestine to the UN.
Ce jour-là, l'Assemblée générale ouvre un dossier qui ne quittera plus jamais son ordre du jour. Aucune terre au monde n'a donné lieu à autant de débats dans cette salle. Une commission de l'ONU part en Palestine. Sa composition est le fruit d'un savant dosage géopolitique. Depuis 25 ans, c'est la 17e commission d'enquête en Palestine. Mais celle-ci va jouer un rôle capital. Pendant qu'ils inspectent, qu'ils essayent de comprendre et qu'ils cherchent une solution à une situation déjà très complexe, la Haganah prépare soigneusement une action pour les influencer. C'est l'affaire de l'Exodus. Plusieurs membres de la Commission des Nations Unies assistent à ces scènes tragiques et leur décision est prise, il faut mettre un terme au mandat britannique. Mais à qui transmettre la souveraineté? À qui appartient la Palestine? Les 11 diplomates hésitent. Finalement, 8 d'entre eux proposent de partager le pays en 2 États. Un État juif en bleu, un État arabe en gris. Imbriqués l'un dans l'autre dans un tracé compliqué. Jérusalem aura un statut international et ne fera partie d'aucun des 2 États. Les Juifs reçoivent plus de la moitié du territoire, alors qu'ils ne constituent que le tiers de la population. Des centaines de milliers d'Arabes devront vivre sous un gouvernement juif.
and the Palestinian Arabs didn't, because they were still 2/3 of the population, and they felt this was unjust. But nonetheless, this partition, which was approved in the UN after Thanksgiving in 1947, officially recognized two states.
In 1947, the Jews owned 5.8% of the land. In the UN partition plan, the Jews ended up with 56% of the land, almost 10 times of what they actually owned. The Palestinians had half of their land stolen right under their noses. Their population was split into two, half of it living in the Zionist state as a minority. Even in the borders of the Jewish state, the Jews owned only 11% of the land.
À l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies, le délégué syrien.
Ce projet restera le plus grand scandale politique de tous les siècles. Yes. South Africa? Yes. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes. The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Why would the UN be so blatantly pro-Zionist? Do not underestimate the power of guilt. Anyone heard of the Holocaust? The UN sought to compensate the Jews over the deaths of 6 million Jews in World War II. That the Palestinians should pay for it makes perfect sense. However, this amount of land, more than half of Palestine, was still not enough for the Zionists. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist movement in Palestine, wrote in 1937, "The Arabs will have to go. But one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war." The Palestinians had no desire to fight the Zionists or start a war. They were used to living under different sovereigns for hundreds of years: Egyptians, Turks, British, and now the Zionists. In 1948, Ben-Gurion tells the Jewish agency executives, "I believe that the majority of the Palestinian masses accept the partition as fait accompli, and do not believe it is possible to overcome or reject it. The decisive majority of them do not want to fight us." Towards the end of 1947, the Zionist leadership came together and drew Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet was about securing the borders of Israel by cleansing, expelling, and destroying Palestinian towns, villages, and urban neighborhoods. The plan was implemented by the Zionist armed forces.
And finally, in March, they began a push to ensure their control of areas that would become Israel under the partition. And as that happened, you began to get many more Palestinian Arabs fleeing, particularly after a massacre at a place called Deir Yassin, although people now think it was probably somewhat over 100, but not 200. But Begin and the Irgun and the Stern gang, Yitzhak Shamir was part of that. There was a combined attack in this Palestinian village that massacred many people. And the Palestinians did carry out a retaliatory raid, killing about 70 Jewish doctors on the road to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. But after that, you had mobile radio bands that Begin put into play, threatening more Deir Yassins if the Arabs didn't flee. In other words, you'll be massacred just like Deir Yassin. So it became part of the propaganda.
I became a refugee when I was in a boarding school about 40 kilometers away from my home place. And in April 1948, the headmaster came to us and said, the Jews are attacking people around Tel Aviv, in Jaffa area. They will soon come to our area. I cannot protect you, so you better go home now, quite a bit early, maybe 6 weeks early, before the end of the scholastic year. And I was about 10 at the time, and the distance between the boarding school and my home is about 40 to 60 kilometers, depending on how you do it. And the road to my home was cut off frequently by Zionist soldiers who were riding in jeeps. And the jeeps, I remember clearly, had two machine guns, one pointing forward and the other one pointing backward. And so they would go at terrific speed in the area in which they have no physical presence, except they have garrisons of 30 soldiers in certain locations. We had to walk about 40 kilometers, terrified as a child that one moment we see the jeep and they would kill us. Now, only 6 weeks later, precisely on the 14th, the night of 14th and 15th of May, our home was attacked again by about 24 tanks, which came to cut Gaza Strip. And the Zionists came and they blew up our homes and burned them. They also blew up the school, which my father built in 1920. It's a primary school, which was our pride, because my father built that school at his expense in 1920 when he had no children. They also blew the what's called bayara, which is a well, with motorized well, from which we drink and also we water our gardens and plantations.
It is important to note that during that time the British had almost 70,000 troops in Palestine. Their mandate, which lasted until the 15th of May 1948, was to maintain law and order and to protect civilians. They failed miserably in that obligation. At the same time, in February 1948, Ben-Gurion wrote to his foreign minister, "We will be able not only to defend, but also to take over Palestine as a whole. I am in no doubt of this. We can face all the Arab forces." Confident of their victory, the Zionists declared independence on the 14th of May, 1948.
Le 14 mai 1948 est une journée fatidique. Le dernier haut commissaire britannique quitte la Palestine. L'après-midi même, Ben-Gurion proclame l'indépendance d'Israël.
לפיכך נתכנסנו, אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית, ביום קיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל, ובתוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
And Ben-Gurion became the first prime minister. Between the 30th of March and 15th of May, 1948, 200 villages were occupied and their inhabitants expelled. In some villages, such as Deir Yassin and Ain al-Zaytun, horrible massacres were perpetrated. The towns of Tiberias, Haifa, Tzfat, Beisan, Jaffa, and Accra fell into Zionist hands. As a result, more than 250,000 Palestinians were expelled. All of this took place before the 1948 war even started, before one regular Arab soldier set his foot on Palestinian soil. On the 15th of May, 1948, 7 Arab countries declared war on Israel and invaded Palestine. In a joint public statement, they explained their reasons. The Zionist aggression in Palestine resulted in the exodus of more than 250,000 of its Arab inhabitants, and in their taking refuge in the beginning of the 1948 war, the Arab forces amounted to approximately 22,000 fighters. The Zionists had 40,000 soldiers. While the war was going on, the Zionists increased their ethnic cleansing operations. Villagers were expelled en masse, and massacres occurred in many places. The villages of Hula, Saliyah, and Bassa were but a few to suffer such atrocities during 1948. Once Zionist troops occupied a village that resisted them, they would round up all the men according to lists the intelligence officers would provide. On the whim of the local commander, they would either shoot them or march them away. The biggest expulsion and massacre happened in the city of Lid Ramle. 50,000 people were expelled from the city in a single day. 426 men, women, and children were killed by the Zionist forces. The general in charge of the occupation and expulsion of Lid Ramle was Yitzhak Rabin, who would later become Israel Prime Minister, serving 2 terms. In 1948, the Chicago Sunday Times reported on the Israeli tactics. Practically everything in their way died. Riddled corpses lay by the side of the roads. The London Economist reported the Arab refugees were systematically stripped of all of their belongings. Then, they were sent on their trek to the frontier. The New York Herald Tribune wrote, "The corpses of Arab men, women, and even children strewn about in the wake of the ruthlessly brilliant charge."
بعد القتلة في الأرض والكلاب عم تاكل فيا، كان طفل بين ايديهم ياكلوا فيه. فاتت وراي مرت خالي قالت له بدك اطلعي شو هتشوفي؟ بتقدريش يا كتيبة الغلبة قالت لي، إلا تفوتي اطلعي. قعدت مدة أحلم فيه هذا الولد كيف كانت شكلته.
They conquered 80% of Palestine, destroyed 531 villages, 11 urban neighborhoods and towns. Approximately 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed and were forced to leave everything behind as they fled for their lives. However, the ethnic cleansing didn't stop in 1948. It just shifted gear. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel conquered what was left of Palestine, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, the remaining 20% of Palestine and all the Palestinians were under Zionist control.
En 1982, l'armée israélienne intervient une nouvelle fois au Liban. Elle va jusqu'à Beyrouth pour en chasser l'OLP. C'est l'opération Paix en Galilée. Vaincu, Yasser Arafat et 11 000 combattants évacuent le pays sur des bateaux français, laissant derrière eux les civils palestiniens désarmés. Cela débouchera sur un immense massacre. Les phalangistes chrétiens entrent dans les camps de réfugiés palestiniens de Sabra et de Shatila. Les chefs de l'armée israélienne laissent la tuerie se dérouler sans intervenir. Selon les sources, il y aura entre 700 et 3500 victimes. Sabra et Shatila sont devenus le symbole du martyre palestinien. Mahmoud et les réfugiés des camps attendent toujours de retourner en Palestine. Mais c'est la communauté internationale qui détient les clés de leur avenir.
To create an amazing human invention that only the Zionist ideology could produce. The idea that you can lock at the time 1.5 million now, double the number of 1.5 million, that you can lock them in a regime that is similar to the concept of a prison, with all kinds of variations on the prison concept. It can be an open prison if the inmates behave themselves. They can even go and work outside, provided they come back to be in the prison at the end of the day. They can have autonomy in the prison. They can run their life as they wish, provided they accept the concept. Should they resist, the Israeli government would move quickly into a high security prison with all the punitive measures that harsh wardens would take against inmates in such a situation.
Under the army's protection, and with the government's aid, Israeli settlements were erected in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Today, they cut through the Palestinian land and keep spreading. Some of them, like Ariel and Ma'ale Adumim, are already considered to be cities.
So Israel will essentially occupy 90% of the country, and the Palestinians will get 10% of the country in little tiny islands. And Israel is building, with almost total American support, a $3 billion system of bypass roads and highways throughout the occupied territories that then link them physically into Israel proper. So that one electrical system, one water system. So you create a situation on the ground where it's impossible to detach meaningful territory from Israel for a Palestinian state built. The wall that's being built that Israel calls a fence, because in some parts it's a massive fence, but when it comes to Palestinian populated areas, it becomes a wall. It's a wall twice as high as the Berlin Wall. A 24-foot high concrete wall that physically creates actual prison conditions for entire Palestinian cities, like Tulkarm and Qalqilia, cities of 70,000, 80,000 people, that alienates hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their land, from their water. It has tremendous impact. But what this wall does, the separation wall, is that it then sets these contours, these borders that have been set by the settlement blocks in areas A and B in concrete, so that it's a $2 billion system linked to a $3 billion highway system, linked to I don't know how many billions of dollars in the settlements, all designed to close the Palestinians into these little tiny islands.
The first Intifada was put down by the Israeli government with so much brutality that the UN condemned Israel for violating the Geneva Conventions. The Intifada succeeded, however, in bringing the Palestinian case to the attention of the world.
Is that the The Israeli policy is about maintaining, perfecting the mega prison. And the inevitable happened. It really looks like a prison. It didn't look like a prison in 1967. It looks like a prison. The bureaucracy became real prison wardens. They were not to begin with. And finally, and with this I would end, the greatest, maybe, Israeli success, which I hope this meeting and others would prove that this is a failure, but it is not yet a failure. The greatest success is that 41 years onwards, these Israeli policies are not known. Definitely the fact that they were taken in 1967 and hasn't changed is not known. And that the Israeli, very simplistic demand, not very sophisticated, very transparent lies about what they are doing, that any intelligent person could easily decipher and expose for what they are still being repeated by the mainstream media in the West, including The Guardian, by all the mainstream television networks, including the BBC and ITV and Sky News and what have you, and is accepted by all the political elites of the West, including...
Anyone who questions the occupation of Palestine and the catastrophe Zionism brought on Palestinians is ostracized, silenced, called an anti-Semite, or, in case of a Jew, a self-hating Jew. The Holocaust allows Zionists